Hello, it's Chino here. If you like chess openings, you're in the right place. Today we'll be looking at the first of a four-part series on the Scotch Gambit. So let's go. Pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, attacking the pawn on e5, knight to c6 to defend the pawn on e5, and now the key move, pawn to d4. Here black would usually capture on d4, and if white was to capture knight, the d4 pawn with the knight, that would lead to the Scotch game. But we're not going to look at that. We're looking at bishop to c4, ignoring the pawn for the time being. And this is the starting position of the Scotch Gambit. Now, black has a few moves here. The two key ones are bishop to c5 and knight to f6. Others like bishop to e7 and bishop to b4 are not so good, and we'll look at those in a different video. But for now, let's look at the main line with knight to f6. The knight's obviously threatening to capture the pawn on e4. So white would usually go pawn to e5, at which point the knight needs to move. And of black's several options, pawn to d5 is the move recommended by theory. Other moves are not so good. Now in this position, white would be best advised to move this bishop from c4. It's a much better move than capturing the knight on f6. I won't go into the detail on that, but you can look that up in your spare time. And then now the bishop's out of harm's way, knight to e4. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. Knight takes d4, and as you can see, there is pressure on this knight on c6, so black has to do something about it. Bishop to d7 is the main move. In one of the other series, we'll look at this counter-attacking move with bishop to c5. But let's not get sidetracked for now. So bishop to d7, just trying to defend this c6 square. And then now white has to do something. So after bishop takes c6 and pawn takes c6, which are the most common moves in this position, white castles kingside. I'll just go back one move and just show you something. So it would be very, very, very wrong for white to try and chase the knight with pawn to f3. In fact, this has happened to me in a blitz game before. I'll own up, I'll man up and say. And the problem with this move is black's got this queen to h4 check. And yeah, if the king moves, well, queen f2 is going to be devastating. And obviously pawn to g3 is no good, because after knight takes g3, white can't even capture the knight because of this. Not so good. So just going back a couple of moves. So yeah, after this pawn takes c6, yeah, f3 is not a good idea. So castles kingside, that's the main move. And now by far the most popular move for black, and the most active one, is bishop to c5. Bishop to e7 is possible, but not as active. So bishop to c5 is a more active move. And now white can try and make the knight on e4 feel a bit uncomfortable. With the move pawn to f3, now the queen to h4 check is no longer a possibility. Okay, so the knight has to go somewhere. Only move knight to g5. And then here you see white gain a tempo with pawn to f4. So the knight has to move again. Now by far the most common move is knight to e4. And I'll just simply point out after knight to c6. And that's not as popular. Sorry, knight to e6, not c6. Because white can calmly play c3, defending the knight on d4. And f5 is a strong threat. So in this position, black would probably have to play pawn to f5 to stop white from playing that move. But the problem with this is white can just continue developing with something like bishop to e3. And after, say, castles kingside, knight to d2. And let's say something like bishop takes d4 and pawn takes d4. We see that white has the better position. And the reason is white can simply play knight to b3 and keep a bind on this, c5 square. You can put a rook on this square as well. This backward pawn is going to be a bane of, black's position. So yeah, so just going back to the position, after, I think it was pawn to f4. Yeah, so we just had a slight detour with knight to e6. Yeah, by far the most common move for black here is knight to e4. Just going back to the e4 square, black's trying to take advantage of the fact that, yeah, there are no more pawn moves and possible pawn moves on d3 or f3 to move the knight. But yeah, white has other ideas, so yeah, he or she usually starts with bishop to e3, and just continuing to develop. And this is a key point in the opening. Now, in this position, black has a couple of moves, and so we'll look at them in turn. Bishop to b6 will be our main line, but a move that's become very popular in recent times is queen to b8. We'll look at that in a minute. And castles kingside. Okay, so let's look at queen to b8 first. So obviously, the threat is queen takes b2. Now, it is possible for white to play a gambit with knight to c3, but I think b3, this is the move I'd play, is a lot more simpler to play. It's just a simple pawn move, and we'll see the idea in a minute. It stops queen takes b2, and yeah, after b3, the game could continue something like castles kingside, and now we see an interesting move, queen to d3. Now, the reason we play queen to d3 is because if we play knight d2, which is the standard move in this position, knight to c3 would be a bit, annoying. So we go queen to d3 first. And now in my database, there have been quite a few games, but for some strange reason, this move, rook to d8, seems to be the most common move. Well, against that, we just play knight to c3. And the point here is, yeah, after knight takes c3, queen takes c3, black has to do something about this bishop. If bishop goes to b4 to harass the queen, simply queen to d3, and pawn to c3 could follow next. So this position is dynamically equal. But yeah, I think, based on my experience of playing this a couple of times, I think it's a lot easier for white to play, but your engines will probably tell you this is equal. Yeah, but anyway, that was a small diversion. Just going back to the position after, I think it was bishop e3. So rather than queen b8, the other try, and this is a major one for black, is castles kingside. And you probably face this more often than any of the other moves we're looking at. But here, white just continues in standard fashion with knight to d2. And the point of this move is that after knight takes d2 and queen takes d2, white wants to take control of the dark squares, and you're probably wondering how. Okay, so in this position, there are two key moves for black: bishop to b6 and pawn to f6. Okay, so let's look at pawn to f6 first. Okay, so after pawn to f6, the main line is knight to b3. Yeah, trying to exchange the dark squared bishops and gaining control of the dark squares. But I was looking at this position with an engine and a database, and it turns out that rook a to e1, centralizing the rook, is even better than the immediate, exchange of bishops or the immediate challenge of the bishop on the diagonal. So for example, if black were to continue pawn takes e5, obviously pawn takes e5, we see white has a bit of a space advantage here. And even though this e5 pawn is weak, black has no immediate way to win the pawn or to make the pawn even feel uncomfortable. One try for black would be something like queen to e7, attacking the e5 pawn. But the tactics work for white in this position, so pawn to e6, voila. Now, The point here is obviously that bishop takes e6 isn't possible, because after that move, white would have rook takes f8 check, and play that move first, and after say something like rook takes f8, knight takes e6, when the queen can't capture on e6 because of bishop takes c5, and if bishop takes e3 first, queen takes e3 on white to pawn up. Okay, so that was a bit of a diversion. Just going back to that position after e6. We've just seen bishop takes e6 is impossible. But what if black was to go rook takes f1 check first? Well, after rook takes f1, this move bishop takes e6 still isn't possible. Because after knight takes e6, queen takes e6 would lose to bishop takes e5. And bishop takes e3 would lose to queen takes e3. Okay, so just tracking back a few moves. So yeah, so after rook takes f1 in that position, black could try bishop takes d4. But then after the simple bishop takes d4, queen takes e6. We see this move, queen to f4, key move. And yeah, white's threatening to capture the pawn on c7 for one. And yeah, we see this king is a little bit vulnerable. I mean, black would need to be careful not to move this queen from, any of these squares. For example, queen to d6 would be terrible because of queen to f7 check and eventual mate. So in this position, black would be best advised to try queen to e7, just keeping an eye on the f7 square, at which point white would regain his pawn with queen takes c7. And even if black were to try and simplify with rook to f8, rook takes f8, king takes f8, pawn to h3 would just keep an advantage for white. I mean, this a7 pawn is quite weak, and this h3 pawn was just played to give the king an escape square. So yeah, this would be a better position for white. So yeah, so just going back to this long variation we had. Yeah, after yeah, I think it was queen takes d2. Yeah, we just looked at pawn to f6 and how that turns out a bit better for white. Now the other try, bishop to b6. Yeah, it's probably a much better move. But in this position, after bishop to b6, white has a good continuation here, and that's the move knight to b3. Now, the point of this move is that bishop takes e3, queen takes e3 would give white control of all the dark squares. So that would be a very good continuation for black. So normally black would try this counterplay with pawn to f6. But now we start to see some very curious moves. Bishop to c5. Well, it's not a real threat against this rook, because in truth that bishop can't capture the rook because of this pin on the diagonal. And here we see pawn takes e5, and after pawn takes e5, queen to e7 is another curious move. And the point is bishop takes e7 is impossible because of this pin on the diagonal. So white here would be forced to play something like queen to c3, defending the bishop, and the e5 pawn at the same time. And after something like rook takes f1, check, rook takes f1, rook to f8. So note that black still, counting on this pin on the diagonal. I mean, bishop takes e7 is possible. Rook takes f8, queen takes f8. Yeah, this should be equal. Should be a dynamically equal position. In a few games in my database, white's just played queen to e3. Yeah, so at some point black could trade on c5. At some point, maybe not straight away. He can play queen to e8 now, I think would be advisable now in this position. Or even queen to f5. And the position should be roughly equal. So this is one way to play for black in the position, but I think black would need to time bishop takes c5 to perfection, because if he does it too soon, he'll end up with a very bad game because of these weak pawns on the queen side. So yeah, queen to f5 is a good, waiting move. Yeah, putting some pressure on the e5 pawn, the c2 pawn, and just delaying any capture on c5. Yeah. Okay, so that's a good try for black, and yeah, this should be equal. Okay, so going back to the main line, after bishop to e3, so we just looked at castles, king side, and a few variations after that. Now our main line, after bishop to b6, we'll follow the game between Tedesco and Pomrich, which was a correspondence game in 2017. After bishop to b6, white continued in standard fashion with knight to d2. And now we saw this curious move, pawn to c5. Now, to someone who's unfamiliar with the position, this looks a bit scary, because it looks as though these pawns are just going to steamroll white, in the center of the board. But yeah, not so. Knight just simply retreats to f3. And then after something like knight takes d2, queen takes d2, and there's a bit of pressure on this d4 pawn. Yeah, d4 was played, and now bishop to f2. But I mean, just to point out something here, so the pawns have moved forward, but if you notice, this bishop is almost like a pawn, because the pawns are restricting the scope of that bishop. So it's not too scary for white. In fact, white even has good chances for an advantage in this position, because, yeah, white's pieces are slightly better coordinated. In this particular game, Tedesco, Pomrich, black tried to improve the coordination of his pieces with bishop to c6, getting the bishop on an active diagonal, and also preparing a possible queen to d5, just to keep pressure on this diagonal. And we saw white try pawn to a4, note the threat is pawn to a5, trapping the bishop. So black was forced to play pawn to a5 to stop the pawn move. And now this is a very important move you have to remember. And queen to d3. You'll see why this move is important in a minute, because this queen helps to defend the king side. Okay, so queen to d3, queen to d5. We were expecting that move once the bishop arrived on c6. And now another key move, rook f to e1. And the point, sorry, take that back. I meant rook f to e1. And the point was that after pawn to c4, the queen could go to f1, defending the g2 square, hence allowing this knight to move at some point. Now, in this position, yeah, in the game, black played bishop to b7 and went on to lose. But if we take that move back, analyzing the position with engines shows the best move for black, and the one that keeps the balance is pawn to d3. Brilliant move. And the point of this move is that after pawn takes d3, rook e to d1, attacking the pawn. Black gets a fair bit of counterplay after, say, bishop takes f2 check. And king takes f2 would be an ugly move to play, so queen takes f2. Castles king side. And after something like knight to e1, I mean, there's no way to stop white from winning this pawn. Black would get active counterplay. One example is just simply playing something like pawn to f6, ignoring the pawn. After rook takes d3, queen to e6 coming out of the threat, and pawn takes and queen takes f6. Black's a pawn down, but has very active pieces. So if you notice, this pawn here is under pressure, and the black pieces are slightly better coordinated on white's. So black will get enough counterplay for the pawn if you believe the engines. But yeah, psychologically, it would probably be a bit difficult for a human to play. If we go back a couple of moves, so going back to the position, I think after queen to f1, yeah, so black missed the opportunity to play this move pawn to d3, and instead played bishop to b7. And this was a mistake, an instructive one at that, because now rook a to d1 was very strong. Yeah, you can see 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking the d4 pawn. And yeah, black tried to defend it with pawn to c5. So you'd think that move is a very very safe move to play, but this is where the fireworks started. Pawn to e6, and black correctly declined to win the pawn on e6. I mean, that would have just been losing, and played pawn to f6. So just taking that back for a second, you're probably wondering, well, what happens after pawn takes e6? Well, the point is, rook to e5 would follow. The queen has to go somewhere. So let's say queen to d6, queen takes c4 would happen, or queen to d7, pawn to f5, and we can see rook takes e6 is on the cards. And even if black were to castle kingside, then you have this move, queen takes c4, and black is well on top. Sorry, not black, white is well on top. Just note that this is impossible. Rook takes f5 is impossible, because after rook takes f5, the pawn can't recapture on f5 because of the spin. Yeah, and even this wouldn't help. Something like bishop to a6 wouldn't help, because the queen would just go back. Pawn here, queen takes b6 would happen. Yeah, and this would just be a much better position for white. Okay, so just going back to the position after I think it was pawn to e6. Yeah, black correctly declined with pawn to f6, trying to keep control of the position, but then white continued trying to undermine black's center and played pawn to c3. So note the pawn takes c3 is impossible because of this rook. This rook on the queen. So yeah, black played pawn to d3. And you're probably looking at this position and thinking, well, black's probably doing okay because he has this avalanche of pawns, in the center. But here comes another instructive move. Pawn to b3, exclamation mark. And the point is, pawn takes b3 wouldn't be advisable because of rook takes d3. So in this position, black just declined to capture on b3 and played bishop to a6. But then after pawn takes c4, queen takes c4, and knight to d2. We see another interesting position. You're probably wondering, yeah, there are 2 pawns hanging, so black must be okay. In the game, black played queen takes f4, but let's see what happens after queen takes c3. Well, the problem with that move is knight to e4, sorry. Threatens the queen. And so the queen has to move somewhere. So let's say she goes to queen, she goes to c2. The problem is you got knight to d6 check, ouch. And the king has to lose castling white. So let's say king to e7. Trying to come out of the check. And the problem with that is you'll have knight to f5 check. And if king to d8, you've got e7 check. This cannot be recommended for this cannot be recommended for black. I mean, he's gonna get bruised in the resulting positions. I mean, knight takes g7 is on the cards as well on the next move. Yeah, I mean, so for example, after this, knight takes g7 and wins a pawn, and it's worth noting that even this move doesn't really cause white too many problems because of this surprising move, rook to e2. And the point is, obviously, rook takes d2 is threatened, check with check. The point is, bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, and even though black's won, some material, in this position, white's winning because of the strong threat of rook takes d2 check with the double attack against queen. Okay, so just going back to the position after knight to d2, so yeah, instead of queen takes c3, and black's probably worked out he couldn't afford to take that. He played queen takes f4, but then after this move, pawn to c4, so yeah, pawn to c4 is a good move. It takes away this defense of the d3 pawn, if you notice, and it's banking on black not being able to play bishop takes c4, which would be a mistake because of this move, rook to e4, attacking the queen and the bishop. So just going back. So yeah, this move, pawn to c4, was a good move with some tactical elements to it. So realizing he can capture on c4, black played bishop to c7. Bit of, I don't know, no one's going to fall for this checkmate threat on h2, unless they were a complete beginner. Pawn to g3 was simple, and the queen had to move, so black played queen to f5, but then after this move, knight to e4, this pawn is on the threat, and the pawn is on the threat. Now the interesting thing in this position, there's so much tactics in the position, is that even this move, bishop takes c4 would be a bad idea because of this move, rook to c1, and black has to do something about the bishop. For example, if bishop takes e6, moving out of the way, rook takes c5 is very strong. It's attacking, this bishop and the queen at the same time. So yeah. Okay, so just going back to the position after rook to c1, you're probably wondering what happens after this move, pawn to d2. Well, the point here is white has queen takes c4, only move, and after pawn takes c1 or pawn takes e1, I don't know, and rook takes e1, white's still on top. I mean, for example, after castles, something like castle kingside, e7, check, and the rook can't come to f7 because of this. A much stronger move is this one, knight to g5, and the point here is queen takes g5 will lose to rook check, and after rook takes queen, rook takes rook, yeah, checkmate. Okay, so just going back to that position after rook to c1, another try for black here could be, say, queen to d5, defending the bishop. But yeah, I mean, again, you have this threat, knight to d2. This bishop has to move. Let's say the bishop goes to, I don't know, a2, for example. The problem is rook takes c5. So, I mean, what's intriguing about this game is white's just had so many tactics, in his favor. And can you imagine, look at that king. See how far we are into the game and the king's still in the center of the board. That is never a good sign. Yeah, so just going back a little from all these diversions, that we had. If we go back to the position after knight to e4, yeah, that was the one. Yeah, we see bishop takes c4. It's too risky because of rook to c1. So yeah, in the game, black just castled king side. But here, yeah, after pawn to e7, that rook had to go somewhere. Rook f to e8. Queen takes d3 happens. So as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus 5. So equal material for the minute. But black doesn't have too many moves. He played bishop to b7, but just taking that back. Oops. So after queen takes d3, rook takes e7 would have been a mistake because of knight to f6 check. And the point being that after queen takes f6, queen to d5 check, and white's winning material. See that rook in the corner? Yeah, lots of tactics in white's favor, the kind of games I like. So just going back after queen takes d3, and black wasn't going to fall for rook takes e7, so played bishop to b7. Trying to put some pressure on this diagonal. I mean, you would think this diagonal's weak, because white doesn't have a white bishop. But yeah, white had everything under control. Played knight takes c5, threatening the bishop, and yeah, forcing the exchange of queens. And yeah, after this mini exchange, yeah, white emerged the pawn up and went on to win the game in 71 moves it was. I won't look at the rest of the game. I mean, yeah. So yeah, this was an interesting demonstration of how to play the Scotch Gambit. But as we saw in some of the lines, black can gain equality with correct play. So recap very quickly. So after the moves, pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, pawn takes d4, bishop c4. Knight f6 is the move we looked at, and then mainline continuation with bishop d7. Yeah, so in this key position, after bishop to e3, yeah, we just saw several black tries. So we saw queen to b8, which was met with pawn to b3. And we also saw castle's king side, which again was met by knight to d2. And then we saw this move in our mainline game, bishop to b6, which again was met by knight to d2. And the whole point of the variation being white wants to try and challenge black on the dark squares. So yeah, so I mean, as we saw in the game, black here can gain a decent position with correct play, but white has the better chances, as we saw in our main game. So yeah, I hope you like this one, and yeah, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and hope to see you on the next one.